I think it's starting. I think it's started. That's okay. So as I mentioned, what we'll do today is talk through Screaming Frog, this capabilities, and ultimately how you all can take away this webinar or this session, and how you can implement it in your workflows. We'll start off with the mode options, spider mode, list mode, SERP mode, compare mode, and then honestly, we'll spend most of our time, a lot of our time, in configuration. The reason why we'll spend most of our time in configuration is because honestly, you'll need to configure Screaming Frog in such a way where you want to extract pieces of information that are valuable to you. And we'll talk about how that looks like. Now, from here on out, these options, they're going to go by pretty quickly. It just goes to show, it'll go to show the kind of analysis and data that Screaming Frog extracts and presents to you all. It can get pretty nifty, but because they're just reports, it's probably something that we kind of go through really quickly. But if you have any questions, feel free to stop me. Then from there on out, we'll talk about these tabs right here, this tab view, as well as this tab view right here. And then lastly, these set of tabs right here, they all essentially serve different purposes. At a high level, these are just summary views of the information that you've crawled. This is an overall summary of that summary. And then ultimately, this is essentially a summary at a page level. Again, site level, overall site overview, and then page overview. We'll talk about that as we progress. But let's get it started. So the mode here is essentially how you want to extract pieces of information from a set of URLs. So you can see right now, Spider is toggled on. And right now, I've essentially requested Screaming Frog to scour my URL, Edwin Dan Romero. So from there on out, using Spider based on the configuration, it'll act like a bot. It'll scour one page, find a link, find another page, find a whole bunch of other links, crawl those links, and then find a slew of other links. So it acts as much as possible as Googlebot when it tries to retrieve page information as it scours specific HTML. We'll talk about more on how to make it more efficient in our configuration walkthrough. The second from the list here is list. And what that essentially looks like is like this here. Let me just convert it really quick. I went ahead and went to another window, and it removed that URL bar, which is totally fine. List is essentially gives you the options to crawl a specific set of URLs. Maybe you don't want to go ahead and crawl an entire site to retrieve the information that you're looking for. Let's say it's page titles. Maybe you're kind of like me. I work off of website migrations and I QA redirects pretty extensively. I don't want to crawl an entire site just to make sure my redirects are working. Rather, I might be QAing in batches. I might be QAing 5 or 10 URLs. Now, if that's the case, I can reference URLs from a file. I can type in URLs, type them in manually. I can go ahead and paste them. So copying them from maybe an Excel spreadsheet, a text editor, and paste them through my clipboard. Or I may want to go ahead and reference specific XML files. Maybe you have a live XML file that you want to reference and download. You can certainly do that. You can simply just paste the XML file here and have Screaming Frog reference it and crawl the URLs therein. I use this one a lot. Honestly, I love this mode. If for the most part, I think I use this way more than Spider, if I'm being honest. That way, the reason being is I get to pinpoint and focus the data I'm trying to acquire rather than lean on Spider to, come by it. SERP is a mode from which you can honestly extract. Let me see here really quick. Give me one second. Let me go ahead and see if I can pull this up for you all. There we go. So I have a sample set of URLs that I pulled together. I went ahead and referenced that in my file for SERP mode. And what it does is essentially, once you click on a URL, you can start looking at the page titles that you've outlined in the file, as well as the meta descriptions. And Screaming Frog provides an overview of how that looks like, or how that would look like in the SERPs. I'll take a pause here and just give you a story. I've known SEOers to use third-party SERP emulators online to get a feel for how the listing will look like. If I can make my life a lot easier, I like to stay in a single view. So I use this mode predominantly when I try to envision how a SERP listing is going to look like. I don't use third-party tools. I essentially use Screaming Frog. It's pretty awesome. You can go in here and maybe you need to adjust. Maybe I don't want it to read independent SEO. I want it to read awesome guy. Awesome. You can understand how it would emulate within the SERPs. What's more, you can also adjust the description. Hi, I'm Edwin Romero. Hi, I'm Edwin. Hola. Essentially updating how it will look like in the search results. You can add in things like keywords, a prefix, rich snippets. It's pretty nifty. I think it's pretty cool in case you're making a case, making a recommendation on specific meta descriptions or a meta description or metadata strategy. You can take screenshots from here. It can be pretty valuable. Now, going to compare, I don't really use compare all that much, but I can see the value therein. Screaming Frog gives you the option of taking two separate crawls and comparing them against one another. The value from there is essentially, let's say you have a crawl from a month ago. Something had changed. You recrawl the website. You want to understand why maybe performance might be fluctuating. To understand again what has changed and what has been optimized beyond where it was a month ago. I can see the value in this mode here. Now, what I want to do, it's pretty quick now. What I want to do is switch our conversation over to configuration. For that, I'm going to go over here in this exhaustive crawl. So for configuration, you have a slew of options. Most of these I will go into. The only ones I probably won't touch on are CDNs, user interface, not authentication, system. But the rest I will delve into or talk to some degree. So going into configuration, Spider is the first one I really, from the get-go, I want to make sure is configured properly. And the reason why is essentially you get to request Screaming Frog to extract what kind of pieces of information they can extract. In our case here, because it's my site, I decided to extract images, CSS, JavaScript, and Swift. You don't, maybe depending on the project, you don't necessarily need to extract or crawl all these. If your site is massive, you may want to forego crawling any of these. It's not uncommon for me. If I'm a website migration specialist, so often I want to crawl the redirect, I guess, statuses, the status codes. So for that, unless there's a JavaScript redirect in place, I really don't need these resource links. Rather, I essentially untoggle these like so and let the crawler do its work, let the crawler do its magic. Now, let's say you want to go ahead and extract pieces of information like images and JavaScript rendered content. You would need to go ahead and render this. But the benefit of leaving these untoggled is that you get to make the crawl a lot faster. You may find yourself as you're using Screaming Frog, it's slowed down extensively. And a part of it is that these resource links might be called upon or might be referenced. If you don't need them, definitely untoggle them. It'll make your crawl go a lot quicker. In my case, again, I just want to understand the status codes of specific URLs, legacy URLs, and as such, I really don't need to reference images, CSS, JavaScript, unless the occasion calls for it. What's more, or beyond this, I should say, page links. You can configure how Screaming Frog, what kind of links Screaming Frog identifies. You can go ahead and configure internal links, which are basically the links within a site. External links, if you want to crawl those that are pointing outside of the website. If you want to crawl canonicals, pagination, rel next, prev, hreflang tags, as well as other elements like AMP, meta refresh, and iframes. I don't really engage in AMP, meta refresh, or iframes unless, again, the situation calls for it. By and large, I focus on the internal hyperlinks, external links, canonicals, and sometimes pagination. Now, crawl behavior, we can take this a step further by configuring exactly where we want Screaming Frog to crawl. If we want to crawl inside a start folder or beyond it, I leave these two on. So we want to check the links inside a start folder. That is to say, forgive me, check links outside the start folder. So let's say here, they have a really cool blurb. Screaming Frog says, you start your crawl on example.com/blog. You want to go ahead and check the links within example.com/events. That's totally possible. But that's just checking links. If you want to crawl those links, you want to make sure that this is toggled on as well. Not only will it reference the events page, but it'll crawl it as well. Now, this is where also you have to be careful. In case you're not familiar with this option, crawling all subdomains, one of the things that Screaming Frog will look out for is essentially things that live outside your original subdomain. Let's say your website is on a www, and there's reference to a blog.example.com. Now, Screaming Frog will crawl that blog.example.com because it lives, well, for one, this is toggled on, but it lives elsewhere. Let's say it's beyond blog.com, it's help.com, it's customersupport.com, it's another subdomain. It'll crawl all those if those links are found. To conserve your, I guess, the resources within this crawl, I would go ahead and leave this untoggled unless you need to toggle it, unless you are intentionally going after those links outside your subdomain. You can configure whether or not you want to follow internal or external no follows. Whether or not you want to follow those is dependent on your case. I typically don't need those. This is a pretty powerful section as well. The XML sitemaps. Now, I use this a lot because I want to understand where the gap exists between what's covered off in my XML sitemaps and what's found in my actual crawl. So what I request Screaming Frog to do is to crawl linked XML sitemaps, and then I ask them to auto-discover those sitemaps through my robots file. And lastly, just to be triply sure, I ask Screaming Frog to crawl specific sitemaps. You can see here in my crawl, I've listed out those sitemaps here. Again, a part of the goal is to ensure you find that gap. Maybe there are URLs that are picked up on your crawl that are not found in your sitemap that can benefit from being found in those files. Okay. Now, moving on. Extraction. You can dictate what element you want Screaming Frog to extract. Page titles, meta descriptions, H1s, H2s, so on and so forth. Now, a cool benefit to another benefit to this is you can dictate exactly what resources are being used to extract what pieces of information. Maybe you don't want to extract the H2s. Maybe you don't want to extract specific forms. Again, it goes back to conserving that kind of resource allocation. But by and large, I don't think I've ever seen an issue where I've had to untoggle multiple of these unless you're dealing with a massive site. So I typically leave these toggled on. You can request URL details in the form of response times, last modified URLs, HTTP headers. I didn't toggle on HTTP headers for this crawl, but I'll talk about them in a moment. Cookies, as well as directives like MetaRobots and XRobots tag. If you're unfamiliar with those two can be a huge hindrance in how you perform. So let's say your website isn't performing well. There was a recent site update, but you really don't understand where site is, or performance is in free fall or where it's declining. So you can go ahead and toggle on MetaRobots and XRobots to understand maybe there's a no index, no follow tag somewhere found on page or relayed from your server through these here. What's more, you can understand what structured data or schema is being used by toggling on these options: JSON, microdata, RDFA. Schema best practices state that JSON should be leaned on, but you can also toggle on microdata and JSON to understand what's being found on your site. Okay. HTML. So this bucket I've untoggled because if I request Screaming Frog to store both the HTML and the rendered HTML, it's going to eat up a lot of my CPU. Unless I need it, I won't toggle these on, and you'll probably see kind of like the limitations it has when we talk about URL information down here. But for now, because I didn't need it, I untoggled it. You might find yourself needing it, and that's okay. To conserve crawl budget or crawling resources, you can set limitations. You can set limitations around how many URLs you want found, the crawl depth, the actual folder depth, the number of URL parameters, query strings that you pull, the length of the URLs, as well as links and page size. Now, I have here out of the box 5 million URLs are the crawl limits, is the crawl limit. But in all honesty, if you have a site that big, I would restructure how you're approaching your crawls. Maybe you don't need to crawl 5 million. Maybe you just need a subset. Maybe you just need a sample size. But in any case, you can set what the crawl limit is here. Okay. Rendering. So right now I have it set to render. I think out of the box, Screaming Frog has it set to text only. And if I'm just QAing redirects, I typically have it text only as well, unless the site is running off of a single page application, a SPA, JavaScript framework. That might entail you toggling on JavaScript. But for the most part, it's text only. But if you decide you want to do JavaScript, you can have a few options here along with like rendering page speed, the screenshots, I should say, the DOM, as well as flattening iframes. Some of this stuff is a lot of my wheelhouse, but you do have JavaScript options here. Advanced. These advanced options, I don't use substantially. The two that I toggle on that are not out of the box, I believe, are following the redirects and following the canonicals, just because we want to make sure that we honestly retrieve the end result, the targeted location. These other locations, I really don't see a need for it, like respecting the canonicals and respecting the next prev. The reason being is because they're probably going to lean on things like the canonicals. We're going to talk about indexability in a moment, but essentially the indexability column here tells you whether or not a URL is indexable because of the meta robots, the robots.txt, because of a redirect, canonicalization, so on and so forth. So I don't really feel like there's as much of a need to respect the canonicals or toggle these options on. You might find you might need it, and that's totally okay. But again, this is how I essentially crawl my website. Preferences here. Now, this one's a nifty one because you can dictate Screaming Frog to only crawl pages that have page titles or meta descriptions, as well as other URL information within a specific, I guess, confine. Let's say you want to crawl page titles whose characters and pixels length exceed best practices. So you want to go ahead and shorten them. You can certainly dictate that here, as well as meta descriptions. So this is pretty nifty, but something I typically leave kind of out of the box. I don't leverage it all that often, but I can see the value in it. So I know that's a ton to take in just for Spider, and we have all these left to go, but I'll take a pause for a second here, see if there are any comments or questions. All right, let's keep it going. So there's this configuration option content. So this content is essentially I guess this group of settings allows you to configure exactly what the layout of the content is going to be, the content area. I don't use it often, although it's referenced elsewhere in Screaming Frog. I believe it's going to be referenced in custom extraction, the custom options here. But the value of this area here is, let's say you've written up content and you want to make sure that it is devoid of any kind of grammatical errors. You can essentially look at the spelling and grammar errors through these options here. What's more, you can configure duplicative, or you can configure it so it can identify any duplicative pages, so any duplicates, which is pretty awesome. I've used this, I think, a couple of times. It's pretty nifty. It comes with its options of even enabling near duplicates and a percentage for a threshold on what a duplicate would look like. 100% duplicate, 90% duplicate. You can configure this however you'd like. Now, I will caution though, because you're asking Screaming Frog to pull in information beyond the SEO elements, beyond page titles, meta descriptions, and so on and so forth, it is going to eat away at your CPU. So you want to be careful. I think I performed a crawl on my website, which wasn't all that big, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And it did take a lot of resources to go ahead and finalize the crawl. So just something to keep in mind in case you're trying to do this across tens of thousands of URLs, it might not be efficient. If you're doing this across maybe a site that's maybe 20 pages, 50 pages, it might be a lot more doable. So something to consider. Robots. You can configure how the robots are, I guess, configured. Looking at the robot settings, you can dictate, you know what, I want to respect the robots that is being found at the root. You can leave that as is, or you can completely ignore the robots entirely. So you have free reign of an entire site. You're not following what the robot says, or you can ignore what the robot says, but report on what it's basically how it's configured to act, what it's disallowing, whether or not a URL that you've crawled and have information to will be disallowed through the robots. I use a mixture of respect the robots.txt and ignoring the robots, but report the status, because ultimately what we want to understand is what is hindering search engines, what's hindering Google, Bing, and so on and so forth. So these two options I feel like do it justice. Okay. Now, I will say that I've known SEOers to test the robots.txt files through third-party websites. And with Screaming Frog, there really is no need to do that. You can pull in a robots.txt, request that it gets pulled in, and test it accordingly here. So for example, let's say we're disallowing these two subfolders, WP admin and WP includes. In my head, I might say, you know what? I want to exclude anything WP, disallow WP, because in my head, anything WP is sensitive information. All right. But let's say down the road, you want to go ahead and do a WordPress best practices, and you build out your redirect like that. So you test it out and you see it's blocked. So right here, you can test out whether or not the robots.txt is going to be a hindrance for your upcoming site sections. Okay. So this is pretty powerful. Again, you keep it all in Screaming Frog. You don't have to go to a third-party website to do it. I'm gonna X that. URL rewriting. Now, one of the cool things about Screaming Frog is that you can configure, or you can configure how Screaming Frog will behave when it comes to a URL that meets certain criteria. So let's say you have criteria, let's say you have a slew of parameters. You don't want to crawl those parameters. You can ask Screaming Frog to drop those parameters through this portal right here. But let's take it a step further. Let's say you have a list of URLs with a former or a legacy subfolder. Let's call that subfolder legacy dash subfolder. And you want to request that search engine, that Screaming Frog, substitute that legacy subfolder in its crawl for a new set of criteria, new subfolder. You can use that through a regex replace. So I'm not sure if you are all familiar with regex expressions or regular expressions. They can be very powerful when dealing with these types of crawls. Or take it a step further. Let's say you have a staging site. And your live site. You can crawl your staging site, replace the www with STG or something like that through this portal right here. So updating the URLs and essentially what's being displayed when Screaming Frog comes across it. The last option here is to essentially enforce a lowercase discover URL option. Now, pretty straightforward. And if you're ever wondering, like, what does that look like? What will that look like? We can go ahead and use the lowercase example, probably because it's the easiest here. So let's say we have a test subfolder. You can see it's enforcing the lowercase option or lowercase criteria we set right moments ago. Now you can use regex to make it a lot more thorough, a lot more in depth, but that does require some understanding of regex formulas or syntax. That can be a whole webinar unto itself, but it can be extraordinarily powerful. Okay. CDNs, I don't have that much exposure to, if I'm being honest. I don't really use it. I'm sure it's powerful. I really, really don't use it, unfortunately. Include and exclude. Let's say you don't want to crawl an entire site. Rather, you want to crawl a specific subfolder, subfolder dash A. You can state again through wildcards, maybe not regex expressions, but through wildcards, you want to limit your crawl to, in this case here, we can use Screaming Frogs example, include folder. That way you don't get information that you're not going to need, that you're not going to use, and you could focus solely on the information that you're going to need. And then again, you can test out what that's going to look like. So the opposite is true. Let's say you don't want to include a specific subfolder. You can exclude that through this portal view here. Screaming Frog offers an example. So this here, it can be pretty powerful. Again, just to get more of an efficient crawl from your experience here. Speed. So let's say you want to kind of want to up the ante in how quickly you get the crawl information. You can adjust the speed of the crawler, but and this this deserves a pause. This can be very dangerous because, well, honestly, if you up the ante, if you request multiple crawls, multiple pings to a website, it can really take down the website. So in my case here, I requested 5 threads, which equates to 2.6 URLs per second. Now, if you, I've worked with an individual a couple of years ago. He had upped this to 100 threads. So now take this 5 that equals 2.61 URLs per second and move this to 100. That can be a lot of URLs per second. What ended up happening was it took down the site that he was crawling, and it led to a couple of awkward conversations. We got the site up, back and running, but again, this is tied to those DDoS attacks. It can be tied to honestly just constantly constant pings to a website can take down a website. So something to keep in mind. If you're worried about whether or not these threads will impact your site, you can limit the URLs per second. This is honestly is a good safeguard. Okay. User agent. Now, I'm not sure how many are aware of this, but you want to make sure you view a site crawl or a specific set of URLs through the eyes of search engines because you want to understand what they're looking at. Are they getting the information that's going to be pivotal for your business? I set it for Googlebot. You can set it to BingBot, DuckDuckGo. You can even set it for different devices, Streaming Frog, or set it to custom. Now, keep in mind, a lot of sites use traffic control tools like Cloudflare, Akamai that restrict certain bots from accessing the site. So you might find that once you configure the Googlebot user agent, it might be tough to get access to the website. If that's the case, I recommend maybe doing custom. Custom makes it look as if you're just a user accessing the site, no user agent query string. This has helped me a lot, but you can definitely configure this however you like. The HTTP header tags, I really don't use this all that often, but I will say that going back to moments ago, there are a lot of websites that use Cloudflare, Akamai. If you're not familiar with Cloudflare or Akamai, they're meant to deter malicious bots from accessing a website and doing it harm. Um, and as such, as we're crawling as Googlebot, we might be blocked inadvertently. A way to get around that, in some cases, working with your web ops team, you may want to go ahead and possibly, I think it's called like an X token or something, but essentially it's an HTTP header configuration that allows you to bypass that firewall. Okay, something to keep in mind. So they can be pretty powerful here. Custom. This is one of my favorite features of Screaming Frog. Because I work with website migrations, and more specifically, I work with e-commerce website migrations, I use the custom extraction feature pretty extensively. So we'll start off there because I think it's pretty nifty. So you can ask Screaming Frog to crawl a specific web element on a website or a web page. In my case, I like to use SKUs for my PDP redirects. So referencing a legacy SKU and finding a match on a new site SKU. I can use Screaming Frog's custom extraction to identify what a legacy SKU would look like on its legacy PDP. You would need understanding of XPath to build this custom extraction, but in all honesty, it can get pretty straightforward. It's pretty nifty. You can ask it to crawl specific HTML elements inside an HTML element, extract an entire HTML element, just the text, or if you're dealing with JavaScript, extract the function of it. Okay? Let's say, forgive me, it's freezing right now, but let's say you want to crawl or understand whether or not, in my case, I like website migrations. Let's say I want to understand if specific web pages aren't referencing website migrations for maybe internal linking purposes. I can go ahead and ask Screaming Frog to crawl all the URLs that are referencing website migrations. From there on out, I can find a process that eliminates those that do not have website migrations. You can custom search for specific text on a website or a set of pages. This can be pretty powerful when trying to ID where there are content opportunities, internal linking opportunities. It can be, again, pretty useful. And from there on out, oh, here, yeah, it serves as a really cool, has some pretty robust filtering criteria. In our case, we want to create a custom search that does not contain specific text, website migrations within the HTML or the page text, maybe no anchor tags within the header of the document, the body of the document, or specific paths on an HTML document or the content area. Moments ago, we talked about the content area down here. This is where, again, it comes in handy. Let's give it a second. It's freezing. Sorry about that. Awesome. I don't have too much to say about the user interface. I will talk about the API access and its potential. So let's say you're doing an analysis. Let's say you're doing an analysis of a site section that is 10 URLs, right? You want to pull data like sessions, conversions, um, impressions, as well as clicks, uh, and ranking information. Now, this is information that spans across multiple data aggregators. You can't go to Search Console to pick up on Ahrefs data, nor can you go to GA to pick up on, let's say, Moz information. But with Screaming Frog and its API access, what you can do is you can configure access in such a way where you can retrieve that information in a single crawl. You can take those 10 URLs and ultimately ask Screaming Frog to, in addition to the SEO elements, you can pick up on sessions, revenue, you can pick up on clicks, impressions, ranking data. It's super efficient. I use it on a regular basis for analysis purposes. Granted, you have to have keep API keys to get this information. A lot of these aggregators do house it. GA, I think you have to configure API keys for analytics and Search Console. Ahrefs, if you have a subscription to Ahrefs, Majestic, and Moz, they could, I think they can offer you the API key as well. So something to keep in mind. Oops. So this is how it looks like with Google Analytics now that we're here. So Google Analytics, so let's see here. Oh, I have my existing accounts right here. And then ultimately you can configure your date range from which you want to extract and ultimately the metrics that you want to extract from. So you can see here, I have new sessions, new users, sessions, bounce rate, a lot of great information, and then continue to hone in on the information that you want to retrieve. Okay, as well as some limitations. The authentication portion of it, you may not need, but I will say this much. Let's say you're working behind a login. Let's say your site is yet to go live and it's in a development environment. You can provide authentication and tell Screaming Frog, here are the credentials to go ahead and crawl this website. So for example, let's say my website is behind a login, and the only way to access it is to the WP admin portal. Screaming Frog will access that URL that you've put in and attempt to and act as a browser. And so from here on out, you can put in your login credentials and log in behind or access the information behind the login. Okay. All right. So I won't be going to system. As far as system goes, you can configure this stuff here to kind of ease up on the kind of the resources that you're using. Essentially, not make it so heavy on the CPU, make it a lot more efficient. I really don't use this all that much, honestly, just because I configure my crawls for the most part here in Spider. And I block things off my robots so it doesn't eat up a lot of resources. But this can be very powerful, again, for those that are crawling massive sites. So before moving on, I know that's a lot to take in, but before moving on, I do want to stop and pause for any comments or questions. Okay, cool. Well, I will, just to make sure everything's okay, I will move on then. Is everyone still here? I just want to make sure everything's okay.
Still here.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Awesome. So now, the next things the following things we're gonna walk through are essentially reports. And now that we have all this information, I won't be exporting all of these, but just know that it's a slew of data that you can comb through. I've seen individuals make the mistake of using this view and export all this information as a means to assess what the crawl told us they picked up on. But you really don't need that. You can drill down to specific facets of the crawl to extract pieces of information that are really useful for you. So in my case here, we have I'm kind of struggling with how to maneuver through this. So I'm going to touch base on some of these, not all of these. So queued URLs. Let's say you have a pretty extensive crawl, let's say 100,000 URLs, but you don't necessarily, and you're at 75,000 URLs that you've already crawled. You kind of tire yourself out. You want to revisit this. You want to export what you have, but revisit the remaining 25,000, 20,000 URLs at a later time. You can export the queued URLs that you haven't crawled to revisit at a later time. So it's pretty nifty, especially when you have a large site. Links. Now, this is one of my favorite reports because let's say you want to understand what your internal linking structure is like, and ultimately, if whether or not you have redirects, errors, you can certainly extract that information using the inlinks report, the outlinks report, anchor text, as well as external links. I primarily use the outlinks report. Difference between the inlinks and outlinks is essentially the inlinks report will tell you all the URLs that are pointing into a URL. The outlinks report tells you all the links that are coming out of a URL. If that makes sense. We'll talk about that, like how that looks like in a moment as we go down here. Web, you can export all specific information around screenshots. If you've configured your Screaming Frog correctly, you can retrieve screenshots, the request header tags, or the HTTP request headers, the source code, cookies, all information that you might need. What's more, you can export path types. This one I really don't use, so I really can't speak to this much, all that much. Security, you can export all the URLs that have HTTP, HTTPS, a mix of those two. Ultimately, mixed content, insecure URLs, just a lot of stuff about URL information, response codes. Now, you can certainly extract response codes from this tab right here, but you can whittle it down to just filtering out by the URL or the status that you want. Maybe success 200, 200, 300s, JavaScript redirects for any errors or server errors. Again, the goal of it is to make it efficient and not use any information that you don't necessarily need. You can export kind of what we talked about moments ago, the content criteria that you set up earlier, duplicates, near duplicates, any grammatical errors. And it goes on, everyone. It really goes on. Honestly, everything you've configured right here is exportable. That's a word right here. Okay. I won't go into all this stuff. Honestly, it's just, it gets pretty robust. Going into reports, if there are specific reports that you're looking for around redirects, canonicals, paginations, they come out very neat here. I will say, I won't go through all of these, but I will say the one that I get a ton of value from is the redirects report. Now, the redirects report, what it does is, let's say you have multiple redirects in a site crawl, one hop, nothing terrible. But if you're doing a website migration like myself, and you've toggled on redirects, you want to make sure that it is just one hop. It's not a daisy chain. It's not just one hop after another hop after another hop. So the redirect chains report, what it'll do is it'll outline exactly how many redirects a URL had to undergo to resolve to its target location. So that's how I use this report. It's pretty powerful, especially in my line of work, but it's totally dependent on the information that you're trying to get. I'm not walking through all of these just because, not because I want to avoid it, just because it's all going to vary. It's really dependent on how you guys, what information you all are looking to get out of Screaming Frog. You all may not want pagination information, or you may want pagination information. You may just want canonical information. Just know that there's a slew of metrics or slew of data that you can export a lot more easily. Sitemaps. I will talk about this one because this one is actually pretty powerful. So the sitemap information here, or sitemap configuration here. Let's say you are crawling a slew of URLs that you've identified. And let's say you are an ecom website that has faceted search, so that is filtered URLs that are SEO friendly. Most CMSs will most CMSs will not have configuration options for SEO friendly filtered URLs to be embedded within sitemap files. That is to say, out of the box, most of these SEO friendly filtered URLs won't be found in sitemaps. But a workaround is to take those URLs, those SEO friendly filtered URLs, and place them within a crawl them, and export them as a sitemap file. So you're creating a sitemap file and then uploading it to your CMS. And to do that, ultimately, you can configure exactly the criteria you're looking to set out. So 200 status codes is a given. 300, maybe you want to include 300s in your sitemap. I don't know why you would, but 400s and 500s. As well as the content types, no index pages, canonicalized, paginated URLs or PDFs. You can outline when it was last modified, populate that tag, its priority based on crawl depth, how often that's updated within the change frequency tag, and whether or not you want to include any images. And then ultimately, and this is pretty nifty as well. Let's say you're working off of an international website, and you don't have the budget to implement hreflang tags. Sounds silly, right? I mean, for WordPress sites, you can have probably a plugin that does that for you. But for more of these enterprise level CMSs, that can require a whole budget. It can be its whole work stream. So a way to get around that is to configure an hreflang tag sitemap. So an international sitemap, building the relationships between international sites. You can do that with these options here. Okay. Visualizations. So these are essentially graphs and tree graphs around the crawl summary. So like let's take a look at this here. That is not right. Give me 1 second. There we go. Cool. So what I've requested Screaming Frog to do is essentially take my homepage and outline the path from which Screaming Frog found all the URLs on my site. You can see here, it one of my popular. Well, I write about website migration, but I also write about CMS that I'm pretty well adept at, Commerce Cloud. You can see here, Commerce Cloud continues to pop up time and again alongside website migration posts. But you can see also broken URLs, broken links here, or inaccessible links. It's a nice overview. Going down here, visualization directory tree. It's kind of a kind of the same information, just laid out a little bit differently, just an understanding of how your directory is built out. Looking at time, I know I apologize, I've been rambling on for some time. Um, I will speak to actually. I think I'm done on this side here. Crawl analysis. I will talk about this really briefly. Crawl analysis. There are only certain things, only pieces of information you can extract once the crawl is done. So this option looks like, for example, if you crawl an entire site, but you also have requested to cross sitemaps. There's a gap, there's a delta. You can only get that delta once your crawl is performed. So you have to toggle on the crawl analysis after your crawl is done. So I typically toggle this on. You can see here, I already done that. And what that revealed to me is that, scroll down on the right-hand side, at my sitemaps. Oh, here we go. It's revealed to me that there are 76 URLs found in my crawl. Or there are 3 URLs found in my crawl that are not on my sitemap. But because there are category things I really don't want to perform, it's not something that I want to include in my sitemap. So it's information like that that becomes very valuable. I know we have approximately 10 minutes. So what I like to do really quickly is talk through this ribbon up top. So this ribbon up top is essentially all the information that Screaming Frog has gathered on your crawl. You know, essentially things like page titles, meta descriptions, header tags, its indexability status, its indexability. Now, the information that you're looking for may be embedded in here, but that's ultimately dependent on exactly what you're looking for, what you're looking for in your analysis. It can be extraordinarily robust. Look how far it goes. I think at one point, based on a crawl that I was performing, it went as far as I think 120 rows long, but that's because I had custom extractions put in place. But maybe this is too much for you. You don't want all this information. You can drill down, very thoroughly. Let's say you just want page titles. You can extract the page titles just by themselves, or you can do extract just meta descriptions just by themselves. The goal of this is to make your life easier by being as efficient as possible, finding the page titles, finding descriptions, finding the information that matters to you. Um, because I'm in website migrations, I like to review redirect maps. I lean on the response codes pretty thoroughly. I look at essentially this graph right here that tells me, okay, there are 529 200 status code URLs found. If this was a migration of sorts, and I'm queuing the targets, this is not bad. But I'm starting to see redirects, errors, blocked by robots, and a whole bunch of other slew of other pieces of information that I want to dig into. Okay. The internal tab is essentially information about data on your site, not to be confused with the external tab. This tab is information away from your site, information that's found outside of your site. You might need it, you might not. Um, I typically lean on internal here. Security, I don't use security all that much, if I'm being honest. Again, the information becomes very repetitive. It's the content type, the status code, statuses, indexability. This one here is more, I think, around the HTTP versus HTTPS. URL information, see H1s. Again, it's pretty amazing how much Screaming Frog has to offer. Now, I use custom search, custom extraction, as well as my analytics, basically these last couple of options significantly, because we talked about extracting SKUs moments ago. We talked about the API access. All of that is accessible through these options down here. So the other pieces of information, they're great as you focus on the data that you're looking for, but it's all extractable through the internal tab. Now we talked about that. But let's say you don't want, that's way too much information for you. You don't want all that information. You just want information whittled down straight to a URL. That is, again, totally possible. You can, let's go to one that's pretty popular on my site. There you go. Let's go here. Working backwards from a messy SEO migration. So what's nifty is once you select this right here, you can look at the URL information. You can look at things like its status code, its page title, its meta description, ultimately its content type, pretty nuanced information around the page title, all around SEO elements that affect organic visibility. Now, this is pretty nifty. How many links are pointing to it, and ultimately how unique are they? how many links are coming out of it. You know, how many links am I pointing to outside of this website? And now you can take it a step further by reviewing all the inlinks, all the URLs that are pointing to working backwards from a messy SEO migration project. So these are all the locations that are pointing to it. Now, let's say you want to look at all the outlinks, all the URLs coming out of this web page. You can notice right here, from has changed. Inlinks are much more diverse. Outlinks, it's just singular. It's working backwards from a messy website migration, and they're all pointing to separate locations along with its anchored text. You could look at the various image files that are called upon for a specific URL. You can see here. Maybe not that one. This one there. The various resource files that are again being requested. JavaScript, CSS, some depending on your site, it can be pretty exhaustive, maybe not so much. How it looks like within the SERPs, how it's rendered, the source code. My source code isn't populated because I requested Screaming Frog not to store the HTML or the rendered HTML, again, to save space. I think that goes on for the HTTP headers, cookies. I didn't request anything with duplicates or structured data. All these actually I didn't toggle on, but know that things like that we've requested and configured moments ago, you can access through this view right here at a URL on an individual URL basis. Okay. On the right-hand side, I won't spend too much time, but essentially it's the summary of the entire crawl. Nice little view. Total URLs crawled alongside pieces of information like its page titles, its status codes, and so on and so forth. It can just be so exhaustive. The one thing I continue to emphasize is understand what you're looking for. If you're looking for empty page titles, if you're looking for broken links, all that is accessible, but through this here, so it can be very efficient. Now, the last piece of information I will add. Notice I talked about anything and everything here, except file. The reason why I didn't talk about file is because I think it's always nice to wrap up with file. Now, with file is what you can do is essentially treat this as such. The Screaming Frog can be treated. The Screaming Frog crawl can be treated as a file. You can save it, you can export it, you can load it up. It's pretty amazing. Now, let's say I crawled this. I don't want to close it, but leaving it open eats up too much CPU. You want to close it and revisit at a later time. You can go ahead and export that. You can export it, and then ultimately at a later time you can re-import that and examine. Now, let's say you do a very monotonous task. Time and again, you extract SKUs, you look at 404s in such a way, you configure this, that, or whatever. You can set up a specific crawl view. So this is our configuration. You can save it as a template. So you can save it as is. You can load up specific templates or configurations. You can set up default configurations or templates. It can save you a ton of time instead of having to go through the monotony of configuring this, configuring that, so on and so forth. And then ultimately, let's say it is monotonous. Let's say you want to crawl your website time and again, but you don't want to go through the rigmarole of Friday morning, let me crawl. Next Friday morning, let me crawl. You can actually schedule it. You can schedule a reoccurring crawl time and again alongside where it gets saved. It can be Google Drive. I think you can actually save it on your personal computer. But I've seen some folks do very nifty things with the scheduling, importing or exporting to a Google spreadsheet that gets fed into Google Data Studio. It's pretty fascinating. So I know that is a ton to take in, and we have only a couple of minutes left, but I want to open it up to any comments or questions. I know this is a lot I threw at you, so definitely want to open the floor.
No questions, but I just wanted to say thank you before I jump off. This was pretty insightful. So a couple of things I was able to learn that I did not use before. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Ryan said, can you share a copy of the recording? Of course I can.
This was great, Edward.
Thank you. This was great. A lot of good takeaways here. I've been using this for many years and kind of like Excel, forever learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And there are certain things I'm still learning about it. It just really comes down to what you want to get out of it. You know, what you really want to get out of it. Uh, Thank you, Andrew, for the kind compliments. I
You have
appreciate
any
it.
discount codes? I'm about to buy a new license.
I wish, I wish I had a discount code, and I don't. But you know what? It is worth the full price. I feel like the amount of
Upgrade.
time it saves you, and for the cost of it, for like I think Deep Crawl is another crawling software. I think that's on a monthly basis, and it can be pretty hefty cost. This is much more affordable.
I agree. They just raised the price though.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, it's still worth it. Couple
And these
hundred.
and these guys, you know what? They're very nice. So like, if you have any questions or comments, if when I do, I tweet them, and they're always really great about responding. So
Awesome. Take care.
awesome. All right, everyone. If there aren't any more questions, we'll drop. But if you do have questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.